as World War II escalated toward its most intense phase. While battle maps were torn apart by red and blue arrows and decisions were made thousands of miles away on American soil, history was being written with blood and sand in a remote corner of the Pacific. On the afternoon of November 1, 1943, Cape Torokina beach was eerily quiet. The waves still rolled onto shore as they always had. The wind still whispered through scorched palm trees. But the war, something that had roared for hours, had suddenly fallen silent, leaving behind a suffocating void. This was not peace. It was a rare moment when death briefly looked away, and the living stood frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. In that silence, no one knew that the fate of this beach, and of countless lives, had already been decided just hours earlier. By a single, solitary act carried out in darkness, without witnesses and without any chance of turning back. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across sand darkened by seawater and gunpowder smoke. Small waves lapped rhythmically against the shore, as if the ocean itself were trying to erase the memory of what had just unfolded on its surface. Were it not for the charred wrecks of landing craft scattered across the sand, and the shell craters pocking the shoreline, one might have mistaken it for an ordinary afternoon. The silence did not arrive all at once. It settled over the beach like a heavy fog, slowly, leaving ears ringing from the absence of explosions. For the first few seconds, no one believed the fighting had truly stopped. Soldiers lay flat against the decks of landing craft, waiting for the familiar shriek of incoming fire. But it never came. No towering columns of water exploding offshore. No screaming shards of metal tearing through the air. Only the steady sound of waves, so regular it felt foreign. The sea, which had swallowed their comrades only hours earlier, now lay calm, as if it had never carried shattered hulls, torn life vests, and hands disappearing beneath the surface. Oil slicks drifted lazily, reflecting the afternoon light with cold indifference. Occasionally, a charred piece of wood floated past, the final trace of the chaos that had just ended. Landing craft began moving toward the shore. They did not charge forward as before. There was no urgency, no frenzy. Engines droned steadily, slowly, as if the pilots themselves were listening, trying to confirm that death had truly turned away. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder on deck, gripping their rifles, eyes locked on the beach, where fire should still have been raining down. But the shore remained silent. Hull met sand. Steel ramps dropped. No gunfire greeted them. No artillery ripped through the formations. Only the sound of metal scraping sand, and heavy boots stepping onto ground still steeped in the smell of gunpowder. They stepped onto the beach cautiously, like men who could not yet believe they were still alive. No one said it aloud, but all of them felt it. Something was wrong. A place that should have been a killing ground lay unnaturally quiet. And in that silence, hundreds, then thousands of men continued to land, crossing waters where their friends had drowned only hours earlier. Stepping onto a beach without knowing that this calm had been paid for with another man's life. The beach opened. The landing continued. And for a brief moment, the war held its breath. Sergeant James Mitchell moved slowly through the palm forest behind the beach, where the war had passed through, but refused to leave. Tall palm trunks stood motionless, many with their tops blown away, leaves scorched and shredded, hanging like torn rags. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the broken canopy, casting uneven patches of light onto damp earth, making everything seem to shimmer, not from wind, but from the lingering heat of explosions. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. A dry, acrid scent that clung to the throat and refused to fade. Beneath it lay the smell of burned metal, churned earth, and the unmistakable scent of blood beginning to dry under the afternoon sun. Mitchell inhaled slowly, then immediately regretted it. He had grown used to this smell, but never to what it meant. A reminder that people, his comrades, had lived, breathed, and vanished here only moments ago. The patrol advanced in short steps. Spread out, no one spoke, only the crunch of boots on leaves and mud, the soft clink of metal as rifles brushed against straps. Every step was cautious, not only out of fear that enemies might still be hiding, but because at any moment they might step on something they were not meant to see. And then they saw them. American soldiers, his fellow Marines, slumped against palm trunks. Bodies curled as if caught mid-rest. Uniforms dark with mud and blood. Hands still clenched around rifles. Barrels pointed toward the ground. Flies had already begun to gather around the wounds, buzzing slowly, indifferently, as though the war had never existed. Mitchell paused. He knew they were dead, but their resolve remained, unyielding, unbroken. He did not look at their faces. He had learned that lesson early. Faces made everything too personal: age, fear, surprise. Instead, he looked at uniforms, weapons, the positions they had fallen in. Nearby, dozens more bodies lay face down in a shell crater. Half buried in earth, dirt and leaves covered their backs like a makeshift blanket. A hand protruded from the soil. Fingers curled, as if still grasping for something no longer there. The jungle preserved everything. Shrapnel was embedded in tree trunks, twisted, gray metal swallowed by splintered bark, as though the forest itself had tried to hold onto the moment of violence. Some fragments gleamed in the sunlight, others were barely visible, half buried in cracked wood. The trees stood silent, scarred with wounds that would never heal. Dried blood streaked across the ground, dark, cracked, winding between mud, leaves, and overlapping footprints. The trails were not straight, they broke and staggered, like hurried steps that slowed, faltered, and finally stopped. In places, the earth had absorbed nearly all of it, leaving only a faint brown stain, just enough to say that someone had fallen there. Spent shell casings littered the forest floor, lodged between roots, glinting in the afternoon light like lifeless scraps of metal. Long since cooled, they no longer carried heat or sound, only emptiness. Their purpose fulfilled and discarded. A light breeze rustled the palm leaves. The sound was unnervingly loud in the stillness, a reminder that life was returning, slowly, cautiously, but the forest still bore every mark of the morning, a canvas torn apart. Not yet hidden. No testimony was needed. No witnesses required. Every trace told the story of what had happened. Mitchell knew that in a few days, the jungle would begin to erase it all. New leaves would grow, rain would wash away the blood, insects and time would finish the rest. But for now, everything remained, raw and exposed. He signaled the patrol to move on. Their mission was to sweep, record, and advance, not to linger, not to think too deeply. Yet with every step, the weight inside Mitchell grew heavier. Then Mitchell entered a trench and saw them. 5 Japanese soldiers lay scattered near the mouth of a tunnel. Blood streaked across the ground like a narrative trail, not of a large engagement, but of a pursuit. One man. Just one. Mitchell crouched and noticed American bootprints mixed into the mud. Running, slipping, stopping abruptly. Shell casings lay scattered around each bend of the trench, shots fired while moving. That was not standard training. No one was taught to fight like that alone. Then he saw the American. He lay on his back beneath a fallen palm trunk, afternoon sunlight illuminating a face that was still very young. His uniform was dark with blood. A few meters away lay his rifle, and in his right hand, he still clutched a grenade detonator, as if he had never considered letting go. Mitchell knelt and placed 2 fingers on the man's neck. No pulse. He looked around, counting quickly, 5 Japanese soldiers. Then back at the American. Alone. No squad, no support, no rear line. Mitchell began to understand. He stood and walked forward, and then he saw it. A 75mm artillery gun. It sat silent in a dense coconut grove, its barrel still aimed straight at the beach. Inside the position, shells were neatly stacked, unused. The gun was not destroyed. It had simply been abandoned. Mitchell swallowed hard. He could picture it clearly, as if he had been there. A young soldier leaving cover. No orders. No shouted command. Just a brief moment when he lifted himself from the wet sand and the world ahead opened wide, bare. Exposed, unforgiving. Black sand stretched out before him like a naked plain, offering no cover but air and the death waiting within it. He stepped into the light. Sea wind lashed his face, carrying salt and gunpowder smoke. Every step felt heavier, not because of the sinking sand, but because the vast emptiness allowed no mistakes. Behind him, other soldiers held their breath, watching his figure break away from the formation, a solitary silhouette in a space never meant for human survival. Ahead, the artillery gun was still firing. Its barrel glowed red with heat, recoiling violently before snapping back like a chained beast. Each blast tore through the air, crashing into the sea, throwing up towering columns of water before slamming back onto the beach, metal and bodies caught in the wake. The sound did not merely echo, it crushed the chest, knocked the heart off rhythm. There was no pause, no sign of slowing. He saw the movements inside the gun pit, figures shifting, arms loading shells, actions repeated with mechanical coldness. The gun did not know fear. It only knew continuation. The distance began to shrink, meter by meter, amid screaming metal and shockwaves. Sand erupted around his feet. The air trembled with every shot. Here, time did not move in seconds, it moved in firing cycles. He ran. Not because he believed he would survive, but because he knew that if no one did this, everything behind him would continue to be pulverized. Each step pushed him deeper into a space with no return. There were no detours, no cover, only a straight line leading into the gun's mouth. And across that empty stretch of black sand, the young soldier kept running, small, fragile, toward a machine built to kill, in a moment where hesitation would send history down a different path. One decision, made in seconds. No way back. Each footstep sank into wet sand, heavy as if dragging his entire life behind him. Bullets tore past. Explosions crushed the lungs. The air itself seemed to shove him down. But he did not slow. He did not dive for cover. Because if he stopped for even a heartbeat, everything behind him, thousands of men offshore, would die in his place. The gun began to rotate. Slow, certain. Metal groaned under its own weight. The ground trembled, not enough to stop him, but enough to remind him that this was not a man, but a killing machine. The distance closed. 40 meters. A shell slid into the chamber with a metallic clang. 30 meters. Heat radiated from the barrel like a labored breath. 20 meters. The air thickened. All other sounds vanished, leaving only the pounding of his heart, heavy, relentless. At that range, the shell did not need to hit. A near explosion would crush bones, rupture lungs, scatter a body across the sand. He knew it, everyone knew it, but knowledge no longer mattered once his legs were moving faster than thought. He kept running. Sand sprayed with every stride. Rifle fire cracked behind him. But no one had time to aim anymore. Everything was happening too fast, or too slow. Time stretched into breaths, steps, meters seized by pure will. He saw the gun's muzzle. A black circle, cold, deep, capable of swallowing light itself. Fire had erupted from it countless times, tearing sea and shore apart. Now it was aimed directly at him, patiently waiting to finish the job. He saw hands inside the pit, fast, precise, repeating motions born of discipline and fear. No hesitation, no emotion, just routine. And in that moment, he saw death. Not as chaos or violence, but as a calm certainty. Standing at the end of this short path. It did not need to chase him. It knew he was coming. But he did not slow. He did not lower his head. He did not turn away. The final distance vanished in a single heartbeat. Then he reached the pit. His hand gripped the rough concrete edge. His body trembled, the world collapsing into ragged breaths and the smell of hot metal. In that fragile instant, too brief to name, the artillery gun lost its target. For the first time, the massive machine of war was being pressed by a living human being. The firing aperture was never meant for a man, only wide enough for a barrel. Coconut wood scraped his shoulders. Scorching metal burned his skin. Gunpowder, sweat, burning steel, the stench of a killing machine at full output. He forced himself inside. No room to turn. No space for doubt. The gun was still hot. Metal pressed against flesh like a final warning. If the crew fired again, no aiming required. The explosion in that confined space would obliterate everything. The gun, the bunker, the Japanese soldiers, and him. No survivors. But they did not fire. For one brief moment, fear overpowered discipline. The Japanese gunners recoiled into the darkness, instinct overtaking training, and that moment, fragile, unrepeatable, opened the only path forward. He moved. Blood ran down his side, soaking his uniform, heavy and hot. His breathing became ragged, lungs crushed by smoke and exhaustion. His body began to betray his will, muscles shaking, steps slowing, vision dimming, but he kept going, not because he still had strength, but because there was no alternative. He shot them. He destroyed the gun crew. Then he fled, into the trenches. The trenches twisted ahead like the insides of a giant beast, dark, narrow, suffocating. They were not built for comfort, but to slow, trap, and kill intruders. Earthen walls rose steeply, packed with roots and stones, slick and jagged. The ceiling was so low he had to hunch with every step, as if the ground itself demanded submission. The air was thick. Damp earth mixed with smoke, sweat, and scorched metal clogged his throat. Sound was crushed, echoing into distorted fragments, each step sounding like many. Every turn was a lethal question. The trench never ran straight. It bent constantly, creating perfect angles for ambush, for point-blank fire without aiming. One shadow, one wrong movement, and everything ended. Every step was a gamble. And he wagered his life. He moved through space barely wide enough to stand, shoulders brushing dirt walls, rifle tight to his chest, finger ready, but never too early. To stop was to die. Bullets struck earth inches from his head. Dirt showered into his collar. Once, he slipped in the mud and fell hard. Breath punched from his lungs. For a split second, the world became darkness, earth, and a pounding heart. He stood again. Blood soaked through his uniform. Every movement slowed. His body pleaded. Stop. Hide. Survive. But his will refused. If he stopped in this maze, he would never leave it. Discarded equipment littered the trench, crumpled helmets, dropped magazines, broken crates, signs of panic, of retreat without order, and that made it more dangerous. Cornered men fought hardest. He listened. A ragged breath ahead. A sound that did not belong to earth or forest. Then he advanced. There was no room for long strategy, no margin for error. Each meter gained was a victory, paid for in pain, and he did not stop. Did not turn back, because at the end of these trenches was not just the enemy. It was the end of a threat. And until that end was reached, he would keep moving, step by step, through a darkness designed solely to kill him. Not because he believed he would live, but because he understood one simple truth. If he stopped, the gun would fire again. And if it fired, thousands would die. So he kept moving, not in search of glory, but to lock the final door leading to slaughter. Step by step, shot by shot, breath by shattered breath, until his body finally collapsed from exhaustion and wounds bleeding through his clothes. All to ensure one thing. That gun would never fire another round. Mitchell opened the fallen soldier's jacket and searched for his dog tags. Owens, Robert A. Sergeant, USMC. He recorded everything in his notebook: location, time, number of bodies, evidence of combat. But as he closed the book, Mitchell knew no words could fully capture what had happened here. Ahead, landing craft engines roared. Thousands of Marines were coming ashore, walking onto a beach that should have been hell, but was inexplicably quiet. They did not know his name. They did not know his face. They did not know that one man had died so the beach could remain silent. Mitchell stood and looked back one last time. "You're done," he said softly. "We made it because of you." There was no answer. The soldier lay still, face dusted with fine sand and shadowed by palm fronds. Without the wounds, without the dried blood on his uniform, he might have looked like a man resting after a long march. A peace that was almost cruel. Sea wind drifted in, carrying salt and distant waves. Palm leaves rustled gently overhead, whispering like a belated farewell. Behind him, the artillery gun remained silent, its barrel cooling, no longer recoiling, no longer spewing fire into the sea. Offshore, landing craft continued to arrive, Soldier after soldier stepped onto a beach no longer torn apart by artillery. They ran through what should have been a killing zone, unaware that this silence had been purchased with the life of a man they would never meet. The landing continued. The war went on. Maps would be redrawn. Arrows would advance a few more miles. But at Cape Torokina, on the afternoon of November 1st, 1943, something had stopped forever: a young soldier, an unhesitating decision, and a gun that would never fire again. There was no grave marker then. No bugle call. Only the sea, the wind, and marching boots moving forward. And so history passed quietly over him. But it could never have moved forward without him.